If the UK is serious about tackling climate change, it must combat military emissions. I'm going to read into this piece from Byline Times, you guys. Let's go. Good morning, good afternoon, good evening, wherever you are in the world. This is Reganelite here with an article from Byline Times with the headline that if the UK is serious about tackling climate change, it must combat military emissions. Like David Lammy, the military recognises the threat of climate breakdown, but that hasn't stopped the sector's vast emissions. Guys, while you're here, make sure you hit the like button and share it across social media so others are notified of this video. So this obviously is about emissions, but more specifically about military ones, because we talk about how we all need to reduce our emissions, do our part to help reduce action from the climate. But one contributor to the climate emissions, and that is damaging towards climate change, is actually war, conflict in itself is actually a contributing factor to the climate change. And as it says here about military emissions here, because tanks, vehicles, helicopters, weapons of war, especially military vehicles, they produce emissions, quite a lot of emissions. And these aren't really taken into account, shall we say, when it comes to countries looking to reduce their emissions, shall we say, from nations. And in no way, shape or form am I implying that weapons and tools of war should be more green. I mean, it sounds a bit daft to say that. Like, should we have more electric military tanks and equipment and whatnot, and less gas emissions and whatnot? It sounds silly, doesn't it, to say something like that? But I would say that we should be stopping more conflicts, ensuring more peace. But we also know that there are many, many countries, and you guys know what I'm talking about here, most of you, I would say, is that many nations rely on wars because it drives up, drives an economy of sorts, a weapons economy. For example, lots of weapons and arms that are sold to conflicts out there that allow money to be made for certain nations as well. War is a dangerous thing. Of course, one of the things we would all love is complete and total peace. But we also know that many will try to drag out conflicts and wars for as long as they possibly can in order to be able to sell lots of weapons and arms and whatnot, not just from governments, but obviously private contractors and whatnot. And all these conflicts contribute to it as well, because it's not obviously just the emissions from weapons and arms that are used in these conflicts. It is the destruction of homes, destruction of lives, all the smoke, the fires that are made from all of these. It is forcing people, obviously displacing them from their homes against their will. All this, it is in fact tied into the climate change, into emissions that are being produced, all this. And unless we find a way to stop conflicts, to stop wars, to stop guns being fired, to stop tanks firing guns, to stop air nukes and bombs being dropped, these are forms of emission in and of itself, and ones that we don't really talk enough about. And it needs to be called out as well. And I'm glad that Byline Times has a report on this, because we didn't really think about this, did we? Let's read into it. So David Lammy's Kew Garden speech on Tuesday echoed what the military has been saying for years, that climate change is a threat multiplier to national security. Yet the military sector is a major contributor to the climate crisis. Its fossil fuel consumption generates an estimated 5.5% of global emissions, without including warfare, and it has a long history of not being transparent about it. The sector does not figure in national targets, and there is no agreed standard for reporting them. The special treatment of the military goes back to the I'm going to mispronounce this word, Kyoto Agreement of 1997, where Madeleine Albright, the US Secretary of State, insisted on an exemption. the loophole survived, allowing the sector to get away with lax and half-hearted reporting without jeopardising its taxpayer funding. Ellie Kinney, campaign director of the Military Emissions Gap Project, notes that the Paris Agreement of 2015 brought a marginal improvement, changing the language of military emissions from exempt to voluntary reporting. But because it's voluntary, countries don't tend to do it very well, she said. And there are glaring omissions like the impact of conflict. Kalani points out the largest omission is the military supply chain and the arms industry that is propping up the creation of products for government. At times of war in Gaza, Sudan, Ukraine, Yemen and other countries, should emissions and climate change be our priority? Should we not be focused on immediate humanitarian impacts of war? Well said. Kennedy points to the intersection of war and climate change, arguing that to understand the full range of impacts on war on an area, the environmental, climate and humanitarian impacts must be included. The emissions report also exposes the scale of military funding. Professor Nida Crawford, author of The Pentagon, Climate Change and War, explains that military emissions are tightly conveals with operations and war, and they're very tightly correlated with military spending. She notes that US military emissions are the highest of any country in the world because the US is the largest military spender. Yeah, they have the biggest budget in the world, they have the biggest force in the world, and America produces more military emissions than anyone else. I don't think there's any debate about that. This affects other countries too. When the US tells its allies to increase their military or NATO spending, or up to of more than 2% of their GDP, those countries' emissions will increase, said Crawford. NGO Commonwealth's recent report notes that during 14 years of austerity imposed by the Conservative government, UK military spending was not only protected, but increased. While other governments' departments suffered cuts, the military receives an outsized proportion of public subsidy and procurement, with expenditure growing by 9.7% from 2013 to 2022. The report adds that from 2012 to 2021, the UK paid more in defence contracts to the single supplier BAE than it committed to international climate finance, and highlighted the immense opportunity that spending could have represented in green industry. The NHS will contribute to the international climate finance. Yeah, so while we were all going through a keen situation of austerity, the Conservative government was still pumping in money into the military. Now, I would be a hypocrite if I didn't say here. I would be a hypocrite if I said that we need to reduce our defence spending. And I can't say that. I do think we need to increase our defence spending. But Regan, by you saying that, that means you're also going against this as well. You're wanting to increase emissions. Yes, I am saying that. I know that's, and without a doubt, it's a conflict of interest within me, because I'm someone that wants to reduce emissions as well. But I also believe the importance of being able for nations to be able to protect themselves as well. So it is a catch-20. It's a catch-22 situation when we talk about the military, guys, and talk about defence in general. So yeah, I can totally understand if people in the comments would call me a hypocrite for wanting defence spending to increase while at the same time wanting emissions to go down, when military spending is tied into emissions as well. So I totally accept that criticism. The former Prime Minister Rishi Sunak reduced UK foreign aid by about $4 billion in 2020. Meanwhile, UK military spending increased, reaching $68.5 billion in 2022, making the UK the sixth highest spending country globally. Commonwealth argues that those countries with the most responsibility for military emissions, noticeably the UK and the US, should adopt a military-focused climate reparations approach. This would redirect military spending to countries which have suffered from centuries of colonialism, extreme extractionism and underinvestment and debt serving. Those countries are the least responsible for the climate crisis, but with high vulnerability to its impacts. Commonwealth reports examines the UK and UK's military role over the 20th century, describing them as the architect of the fossil economy. This determines UK and US military activity over the Middle East. For example, the British Empire's division and former Ottoman regions was explicitly designed around plans for hydrocarbon pipelines. Crawford describes the continuation of missions which resulted from US bases, which ensured access to plutonium in the Persian Gulf, or, for example, the Strait of Malaya. I know I'm mispronouncing words, guys. David Lammy's comments on the fundamental, systematic, and pervasive threats from the climate crisis affirm what the military have known for decades. Crawford found as early as the mid-1950s the US military was at the forefront of the research into climate change. The US Office of Naval Research founded important early studies on climate change. The work then reported to President Johnson, later to President Nixon, and then to President Carter. But this long-standing understanding did not prevent the sector's vast increase in consumption of fossil fuels over the 20th century. In the run-up to COP29, the Conflict and Environment Observatories argued that we must get military emissions on the table and finally agree rigorous standards for tracking and reporting emissions. I do agree with this assessment. Sorry, my throat's really dry. I apologise. I do agree that we should be seeing the emissions that are being produced by militaries out there. I do think, yeah, this is something that needs to be had. Now, I'm no way, shape or form saying that. I'm not stating, okay, because I know some people might say this. I'm not stating that militaries should be reduced as of right now. I'm not stating that. What I'm saying is that we should be allowed to see the emissions that they are producing, and what actions can they take to reduce emissions while maintaining a significant military force as well. Carnegie says regulations need to come from the UNFCCC to make militaries accountable for their contribution to the climate crisis and the situation we're now in. Transparency of emissions will provide a first step towards accountability and re-evaluation of the role of the military in the world suffering from the ravages of climate change. Lammy has recognised the systematic threat of climate change and says the US has a key role to play in global efforts. Getting to grips with military emissions is long overdue. I did say long overdue. I did that at the end there, but I do think it's... I 100% agree that we should be tracking emissions, military emissions. I do 100% agree with that. And I do think militaries, especially the largest ones on the planet, i.e. US, UK, China, whatever, should be looking at ways to reduce their military emissions while at the same time they can maintain their force. I don't know how you would do that. Don't ask me how to square the peg into the round hole analogy, guys, because I would not know. But there are people much smarter than me that would be able to make this happen. There are people capable of doing this. I do think there needs to be a realism about this. Wars and conflicts contributing to the emissions as well. We talk a lot about how governments and whatnot need to do more to reduce their emissions on climate change. But this is the first time we've ever talked about the impact that the military and war and has an impact on emissions and affects the climate in total as well, because it does play a massive factor into this, and I think it's a really important that we call it out for what this is. And I think this is a great piece from Byline Times. Well, what do you guys think? What do you guys make about tackling climate change through combat military emissions? What do you guys make about some of the largest armed forces across the world and the amount of emissions that they could be giving out? What do you guys think? Let me know all your thoughts and down in the comment section below. If you found this video interesting, please hit the like button. We greatly appreciate it. Share it across social media so others are notified of this video. If you haven't subscribed already, please consider subscribing because it really does help support the channel. And if you want to go one step further and support me and the work that I do here, you can do so by becoming a YouTube member for as little as 99p, or join me on Rumble or Patreon for exclusive content on those platforms. So thank you all so much for watching, and I hope to catch you all very, very soon.